Hello and welcome to the EU External Anti-Corruption Promotion, a case study on Moldova. I'm Eliana.
And I'm Mihai.
From the Moldovan German Forum, a Chisinau-based non-governmental organization whose aim is to enhance the European integration process in Moldova.
In 5 podcast episodes, we discuss corruption and EU efforts against corruption in Moldova. This research project is supported by the Institut für Europaeische Politik within the framework of the Eurasia Lab and Fellowship Program. In our last episode, we talked about the objectives of the EU in the area of anti-corruption. We observed that tackling corruption in Moldova is an EU priority, both explicitly and implicitly. We saw that anti-corruption is reflected in the court document governing EU-Moldova relations, the Association Agreement.
At the same time, tackling corruption is closely connected to other EU objectives, including the promotion of EU values and norms and the pursuance of security and stability-related interests, as corruption stands against the rule of law and good governance, and tackling it is essential for the creation of an area of freedom, security and justice, a common legal space where EU law is effectively applied.
In our third episode, today we want to discuss how the EU actually operationalizes anti-corruption vis-à-vis Moldova.
Yes, in other words, what are the legally binding tools through which the EU tries to achieve its ambitious anti-corruption objectives in Moldova?
So, let's have a closer look at the Association Agreement, which is the central legal instrument through which the EU pursues to monitor and enforce the adoption and implementation of anti-corruption rules.
And let's start with how the EU actually defines corruption in the Association Agreement, because the document actually provides a straightforward definition of active and passive corruption. Protocol 4 to the Association Agreement, which forms an integral part of the agreement, defines active corruption as the deliberate action of whoever promises or gives, directly or through an intermediary, an advantage of any kind whatsoever to an official, for himself or for a third party, for him to act or to refrain from acting in accordance with his duty or in the exercise of his functions, in breach of his official duties, and here it gets interesting, in a way which damages or is likely to damage the financial interests of the EU.
Thank you, Eliana. Now, there are 2 interesting things about this definition. The first interesting aspect is that from the outset and throughout the entire 700 pages long association agreement, the act of corruption is defined as being inextricably linked to the EU's financial interests. In other words, the EU pays special attention to tackling the kind of corruption that threatens the fraud-free, sound financial management of EU funds in Moldova. And it is primarily interested that EU-funded projects are properly implemented.
This is a pretty narrow and limited conceptualization of corruption. And we have seen in our last episode that the specialized academic literature and the EU actually conceptualize corruption in a much broader way as abuse of power for private gain. Is it possible that Protocol 4 only applies to those specific parts of the association agreement that explicitly deal with the protection of the EU's financial interests?
Well, Protocol 4 explicitly says that its definitions apply, and I quote, for the purposes of this agreement.
Okay.
And there is nothing in the association agreement that excludes the application of the protocol to other parts of the association agreement which refer to anti-corruption.
Like, for example, Article 16 of the association agreement, which provides the most clear-cut reference to anti-corruption.
In our last episode, we talked about the objectives of the EU in the area of anti-corruption. We observed that tackling corruption in Moldova is an EU priority, both explicitly and implicitly. We saw that anti-corruption is reflected in the court document governing EU-Moldova relations, the Association Agreement.
At the same time, tackling corruption is closely connected to other EU objectives, including the promotion of EU values and norms and the pursuance of security and stability-related interests, as corruption stands against the rule of law and good governance, and tackling it is essential for the creation of an area of freedom, security and justice, a common legal space where EU law is effectively applied.
In our third episode, today we want to discuss how the EU actually...
Article 16 refers to anti-corruption as an area of domestic reform, and foresees that the EU and Moldova cooperate on preventing and combating active and passive corruption, both in the private and public sector.
Yes, since there is no other definition of corruption than in Protocol 4, we have to assume that, at least from a legal point of view, also in Article 16, corruption is understood as being narrowly linked to the EU's financial interests.
And it's not that the EU acquis communautaire, which entails the entirety of accumulated legislation, legal acts, and court decisions that constitute the body of the European Union law, does not have a broader corruption definition. The EU Anti-Corruption Convention of 1997 defines corruption completely decoupled from the EU's financial interests, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. And this brings us to the second interesting observation that we can draw from the corruption definition in the association agreement that you, Eliana, read. The corruption definition in Protocol 4 is identical to the one provided in an important anti-corruption legal instrument that is applicable in the EU internal context vis-à-vis member states, which is the Protocol to the Convention on the Protection of the European Community's Financial Interests from 1996. So, although the EU could have included the broader definition of corruption from the Anti-Corruption Convention, it deliberately chose the more limited one.
What is remarkable, I'd say, is that this narrow understanding of corruption is also backed up by a considerable legal toolbox. Title 6, Chapter 2 of the Association Agreement, which deals with the protection of the EU's financial interests, entails the most detailed anti-corruption standards, the most far-reaching legislative approximation commitments, and the most comprehensive monitoring and enforcement mechanisms.
That's absolutely right. And what is even more interesting is that, just like with the definition of corruption, this legal toolbox is entirely derived from the EU acquis communautaire. As a consequence of increased cases of misappropriation of EU funds in member states, early on, the EU adopted measures that were aimed at ensuring the effective management of the EU budget and the prevention of fraud in the disbursement of EU funds. Among the relevant legal frameworks are the Convention on the Protection of the European Community's Financial Interests of 1995, the already mentioned first protocol to the Convention, and the second protocol to the Convention of 1997. These measures established a commonly accepted definition of corruption, criminalized for the first time in Europe and EU-wide cross-border bribery involving public officials, and improved the prosecution and judicial cooperation in cases of cross-border corruption. Moreover, they harmonized the disparate frameworks of member states in the area of administrative sanctions and gave the Commission the authority to carry out administrative controls and apply sanctions horizontally across all budget sectors. Significantly, to adopt all these legal measures, the EU could rely on legal competences conferred upon it by the treaties. Already the Treaty of Maastricht of 1993 stated that at EU level, member states shall take the same measures to counter fraud affecting the financial interests of the community as they take to counter fraud affecting their own financial interests.
And how do all these EU internal legal instruments translate vis-à-vis Moldova?
Well, the existence of these anti-corruption legal instruments in the EU acquis and the EU's experience and expertise in protecting its financial interests is crucial and makes all the difference. The association agreement essentially draws on the developed EU acquis in this area and specifies, with reference to the exact provision in the EU internal legislation, the concrete standards or benchmarks that Moldova is obliged to transpose into its national legislation. Moreover, it also details the speed of the approximation commitments, laying out precise deadlines for implementation. Even more important, Chapter 2 of Title 6 entails a sophisticated monitoring mechanism related to aspects of adoption and implementation.
The European Commission is entitled to obtain evidence and conduct audits and on-the-spot missions in Moldova to the same extent as in EU member states.
In fact, EU institutions and agencies' legal competences are directly defined by EU internal legislation. To examine whether expenditure related to the implementation of EU funds respects the principles of sound financial management and the EU's financial interests, the Commission, the European Court of Auditors, and the European Anti-Fraud Office, or OLAF, may check records or conduct documentary on spending commitments as well as payments, and if necessary, undertake checks on the premises of any entity in Moldova that is involved in the implementation of EU funds, including also their contractors and subcontractors who have received EU funds directly or indirectly.
Yes, and to enhance this monitoring by the EU, Moldova has wide-ranging reporting duties. Moldovan authorities must inform the Commission without delay of any notice on suspended or actual cases of fraud, corruption, and other irregularity, including conflict of interest in connection with the implementation of EU funds.
And what is more, the European Commission has the competence to adopt far-reaching administrative measures and penalties towards economic operators in Moldova that are involved in the misappropriation of EU funds. These may consist in an obligation to pay or repay the amounts wrongly received from EU funds, administrative fines, the total or partial removal of EU funds, or the exclusion of tenders from all EU contracts and grants for a certain period of time.
The Commission is even entitled to recover EU funds on its own, in particular through financial corrections.
And Moldovan authorities are obliged to enforce the Commission's measures without any further control. And the Court of Justice of the European Union has the sole jurisdiction over the legality of the enforcement.
This is unprecedented in other international agreements of the EU with third countries.
Indeed.
In contrast to the sophisticated approximation commitments and monitoring and enforcement mechanisms in the part of the association agreement dealing with the protection of the EU's financial interests, Article 16 of the association agreement, which again more broadly aims at preventing and combating corruption, remains utterly vague. This naive form of benchmarking is also visible in Article 12 of the Association Agreement, where the EU and Moldova are called upon to attach particular importance to the promotion of the rule of law, including the independence of the judiciary, access to justice, and the right to a fair trial.
Yes, absolutely. And again, no approximation commitments, no monitoring, no enforcement. And significantly, in view of our next episode, where we will speak about the Council of Europe anti-corruption instruments, the same is the case in the area of illegal party funding. Chapter 7, Title 4 of the Association Agreement, which is more broadly related to the management of public finances, merely foresees, and I quote, the implementation of international standards as well as EU good practice, which will contribute to the development of a modern public finance management system in the Republic of Moldova, compatible with basic EU and international principles of transparency, accountability, economy, efficiency, and effectiveness.
Significantly, the lack of legal instruments and benchmarks vis-à-vis Moldova in these areas seems to reflect a weak EU acquis and the absence of internal EU legislation in the exactly same areas.
Surprisingly, the lack of concrete benchmarks for implementation can also be seen in the so-called Visa Liberalization Action Plan of 2011 and the current visa suspension mechanism.
The Visa Liberalization Action Plan, which Moldova implemented in 2013-2014, paved the way to the visa-free regime for Moldovan citizens in 2014, while the Visa Suspension Mechanism, which is a post-visa liberalization safeguard system, was established to ensure the continued fulfillment of the visa liberalization requirements. If the European Commission or EU member states come to the conclusion that, as a consequence of visa-free travel from Moldova, there are security risks in one or more EU countries, then the Commission may suspend the visa-free regime, something that hasn't happened so far.
Yes, exactly.
But what do these two legal instruments have to do with tackling corruption in Moldova?
Well, to grant Moldova a visa-free regime within the framework of the so-called visa liberalization dialogue, the EU set up a series of 4 so-called blocks of technically relevant benchmarks. Block 3 of the Visa Liberalization Action Plan on public order and security includes several aspects related to anti-corruption. These refer to, among others, the adoption and implementation of legislation on preventing and fighting corruption, ensuring the efficient functioning of independent anti-corruption bodies, and strengthening the coordination and information exchange between them. After Moldova was granted visa liberalization, the visa suspension mechanism monitors, as you rightly pointed out, Eliana, the continued fulfillment of Moldova of the requirements in Block 3. But notwithstanding the visa liberalization action plan, did not further detail the concrete design of the necessary anti-corruption actions that were expected from Moldova. The document did neither clarify the exact definition of corruption nor specify the preventive or repressive elements needed to be achieved to tackle the phenomenon. In particular, the action plan lacks concrete lists of priorities, does not provide performance indicators, does not specify human and financial resources for implementation or criteria for evaluation, and does not entail concrete timetables. And despite ongoing serious problems as regards corruption, and these problems, by the way, are clearly pointed out by the Commission in these reports under the visa suspension mechanism, visa liberalization has never been suspended.
Yes, the banking fraud, delays in the adoption and implementation of important anti-corruption rules, the politicization of the judicial sector, the controversial amendments to the electoral law in 2017, harshly criticized by the Venice Commission, and the dubious invalidation of the mayoral election in Chisinau in 2018, which led the European Parliament to clearly state that Moldova is a state captured by oligarchic interests. But coming back to my earlier observation with regard to the area of illegal party funding, also in the area of freedom, security and justice, it seems to me, the lack of precise benchmarks and consequent follow-up by the EU seems to reflect the absence of EU internal legal instruments.
Yes, there is indeed a connection between a strong EU acquis communautaire in a particular area and the existence of anti-corruption standards in that area, of legal templates and monitoring and enforcement mechanisms. And inversely, in areas where the EU has a weak EU acquis, there is an absence of EU anti-corruption tools vis-à-vis Moldova. So, to put it in a nutshell, I think that the policy area against fraud for the protection of these financial interests shows that strong EU legal competences and a wide EU acquis does translate into a strong EU capability to tackle corruption, meaning that the EU has the ability to monitor and enforce the adoption and implementation of anti-corruption rules in Moldova.
This reminds me of the so-called Brussels effect, to come back to the title of our episode, which was conceptualized by Anu Bradford. By it, Bradford describes a process of unilateral regulatory globalization caused by the EU, in which the EU externalizes its laws outside its borders through market mechanisms. In effect, different entities end up complying with EU laws. This strong regulatory capability of the EU, even if in our case for different reasons than described by Bradford, seems to be present also in this area for the protection of the EU's financial interests.
Oh yes, this regulatory approximation to the EU acquis is definitely there. In the case of Moldova, we can even speak of external governance promotion via or through the EU acquis. And this regulatory capability of the EU in the policy area against fraud for the protection of these financial interests showed in Moldova. Not only has the Moldovan national legislation changed considerably, coming closer and closer to EU standards and norms, but also in practice, things in Moldova have positively changed. I only mention here the online asset declaration system, e-Integritate, the national asset recovery mechanism, increased transparency in public finances, the setup of institutions with investigative capabilities, all of which were conditioned by the EU. Of course, things are far from being perfect and significant problems remain, but so much has been achieved in the past years.
The EU has also demonstrated a very high degree of responsiveness towards progress in the investigation of the banking fraud scandal, which again shows how important this area is for the EU. Whereas prior to the surprise power change in June 2019, the EU suspended both budget assistance and microfinancial assistance, between July and October 2019, the EU disbursed over 80 million euro of financial assistance.
Yes, just a short recap for our listeners. In June 2019, an unlikely coalition of pro-European and pro-Russian political forces united to oust the, at that time, omnipresent and most powerful oligarch, Vladimir Plahotniuc, and his regime, which is believed to be the main beneficiary of the billion-dollar fraud. Following this power change, the new governing coalition announced a de-oligarchization package and promised to investigate the banking fraud and bring those responsible to justice.
For that purpose, the governing coalition started a parliamentary investigation on the banking fraud scandal, and in response, the EU reacted in an unprecedentedly swift manner. Besides disbursing large amounts of money, the EU also pledged strong political support to the new government. This was evidenced during the large number of high-level meetings between Prime Minister Sandu and their counterparts from EU institutions, all of which were characterized by an outstandingly positive and generous tone. The High Representative Federica Mogherini enthusiastically spoke of the dawn of a new era in the country, and Johannes Hahn, at that time European Commissioner for Neighbourhood and Enlargement Negotiation, of a front load of trust. We have arrived at the end of our episode. Looking at the EU-Moldova Association Agreement, the core legal instrument through which the EU pursues to monitor and enforce the application and implementation of anti-corruption rules. Looking at the Visa Liberalization Action Plan and the Visa Suspension Mechanism. And briefly looking at the EU financial conditionality, we discussed the legally binding tools through which the EU tries to achieve its anti-corruption ambitions in Moldova. More concretely, we talked about the way the EU operationalizes anti-corruption promotion. We saw that the legal tools in the policy area against fraud for the protection of the EU's financial interests available to the EU are truly remarkable. In this policy area, the EU imposed upon Moldova far-reaching approximation commitments and applies sophisticated monitoring and enforcement mechanisms. The European Commission even has the competence to apply administrative measures and penalties and recover misappropriated EU funds.
And we also drew a comparison to the other areas of the association agreement that deal with anti-corruption in a more clear-cut manner, as a primary order objective, so to speak, observing that those areas experience a rather stepmotherly treatment, with no benchmarks, no approximation commitments, and no monitoring and enforcement tools for the EU. This includes the area of illegal party funding that we will talk about in depth in our next episode.
Thank you for taking the time out of your day to listen to our podcast. If you have learned something new today, please share this episode with your network or tell a friend about it.
If you would like to cooperate with us or have a burning question you need answered, you can reach us at info@fmg.md. Talk to you next time.